You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, Kristen Webster returns as we continue talking about movies with ambiguity. Here we go. Welcome back to the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Bernie Gonzalez. With me today, fellow co-host Pete Charbonneau, and we're talking to returning guest Kristen Webster, who's been on the Fan2Fan Podcast before and graciously decided to come back on. Kristen, we've talked about Mulholland Drive, Donnie Darko, Tour Theory, and your background is in film editing, but you teach film studies classes, foreign cinema. So in part one, we began our conversation about movies with ambiguity. We talked about directors, including Christopher Nolan, Hitchcock, Neil LaBute, movies like Interstellar, Inception, Oppenheimer, The Shining, The Graduate, Shape of Things, 2001, how these movies made us feel, whether they had a definitive ending or left a bit of a cliffhanger, whether it was emotional, whether it was intentional or not. Kristen made her case, especially from her unique perspective as a teacher, an educator with film students, currently talking to film students that have a different perspective, a different lens when they're looking at films, and specifically when we're talking about things like ambiguity. So let's continue our conversation with Kristen. I was thinking, too, because we were talking about intentionality, a movie that made a really big impact on me was Night of the Living Dead.
Welcome to a night of total terror. Night of the Living Dead.
How people interpreted Night of the Living Dead after the fact, and how people saw that it was maybe a commentary on the Red Scare in civil rights and racism, but then Romero being very, very harsh and be like, that's not what my movie's about. And maybe towards the end of his life, I think he reclaimed some of that. I think there was a little bit of like, I don't know, just him maybe realizing that, oh, well, maybe this was part of what I was saying, but it's also the time. So you have to think about when the movie was being made. Thinking of Tarantino, too, like there's that scene in Inglourious Bastards where it's Michael Fassbender and it's the other Nazi guy, and they've got they're playing the card game. They're playing the card games. And through all the guesses, he's basically giving him guesses that make the other Nazi soldier believe that it's, I think he's like, it's like a black person's life in America, something like that. Yep. And then, and when he's King like, Kong. No, it's not. And then, he's like, no, it's King Kong. I remember seeing a commentary with Tarantino in that scene where somebody said, wait, do you think King Kong is about slavery, the slave trade? And he's like, yeah, duh, of course it is. And then thinking like, like, did the people who made King Kong also think that? Were they like, hey, by the way, we're going to make this movie about a giant ape that's taken out of its home in chains on a boat and then put in a place where it's going to be used as a spectacle and for entertainment. It's like, and to make money off of it, it's like, oh, yeah, shit. Like, that's the scene in Inglourious Bastards. And be like, but did you guys mean to do that? Well, we didn't mean to do that. Versus, like, it sounds like a zone. And I think to argue too, Lynch, like it seems like, again, it's something they did on purpose. Like, if we leave that last scene where we don't know who Julie was and who that woman is in that publisher's office, then it makes you wonder what the rest of the movie.
Yes. It allows you to reflect, but not in a confused way. It actually, I feel like, opens possibilities. Like, oh, maybe it was this. I do think there's a difference. And going back, Pete, you brought something up about Lynch, about his like stream of consciousness. I do know that he studies transcendental meditation. Like he's a very devout student of that. So I absolutely think that a lot of his work is probably stream of consciousness and maybe going into other layers of consciousness. But I think, and I get it, but for me as an audience member, I still will struggle if it's not a deliberate element. And I do think that stream of consciousness, it's hard. I mean, writing that's done stream of consciousness, it's hard to follow. I tried to read The Subterraneans by Jack Kerouac in high school and was like, where's the period? Where are the commas? Punctuation mark. So, I mean, it could very well be that. And to somebody, look, to each their own. I mean, he is very successful. He's very talented in his own right. But just personally, I do have problems. And the ambiguity element, I'm going to only talk about one more film because I don't want to hog all the conversation, but there's one more movie that I will die on this hill about, that it'll start fights with friends who loved it. And I don't know really anybody who doesn't like the movie. Blue Valentine.
What's your name?
Go away.
Go away?
Go away.
That's a weird name.
The critics have fallen in love with Blue Valentine. Rolling Stone declares Ryan Gosling gives an emotionally naked performance. And Entertainment Weekly raves Michelle Williams will break your heart. If there's any justice, they'll both earn Oscar nominations for their raw, arresting performances. Now nominated for 2 Golden Globe Awards, including Best Actor and Best Actress.
I love you.
I love you too.
Blue Valentine.
I cannot stand the movie because it's not a complete story. There is this ambiguous hole in that movie. And for me, I feel like we got the beginning. So we got caught up to speed, how they met, and we got the end where they're at. I want to know what the fuck happened that got them there. And I don't want to hear from people, well, you know how relationships are, like things happen. This is what every relationship's like. Every relationship is like, things happen and you get to the point, he did this and he did that. I'm like, yes, but I don't see any of that. All I see is this guy she meets who is really great to her, who really loves her. Yes, it's very fast, but he's willing to be with her and stay with her, even though that child, I hope I'm not reading this for a million people, but it's not his baby. She's pregnant. It's not his baby. And he loves her and he stays with her. But then when we get to the present day, she hates him. She hates him like he is the worst human being on earth. And yes, he works a job where he paints houses. He gets off in the middle of the day and he can drink a beer at noon. I think his character even says, why wouldn't I do this? I love my daughter. I love my wife. I have a good time. And she hates him. And I just want to know, what happened, because you knew who he was. And yes, I get it. That is life. We go into relationships with people. We know who they are. Maya Angelou said it. When somebody shows you who they are the first time, believe them. So he showed her who he was. Why does she hate him so much? And I don't think as an audience member, it's my job to have to pull my experiences to the point that I'm filling in a hole in the story. And that's another way for me to kind of demonstrate the ambiguity I'm talking about that I don't like. I don't want to feel like, how did they get there? Oh, they got there because that's what happens in life. No, that doesn't always happen in life. And also, you were telling me a story. A story has a beginning, middle, and an end. If you want to tell me this story doesn't have an end because it's not over yet, okay, I can buy that a little bit more than there's no middle.
Do you think in your own filmmaking, Kristen, I know you've done freelance work, would a story that comes from you be a byproduct of what you also want to see? Would you tell a story with less ambiguity?
Yes. And I write. I write. I've written some commercials that obviously don't have a narrative structure like a story, but I write screenplays. I think everybody who goes to film school is a writer too. I know for me, what I love is a story about human beings. And I know Blue Valentine is about human beings, but I also think what makes human beings interesting are the complexities about us and the idiosyncrasies about us. I didn't get that in that movie. And if I'm writing something, I want people to feel like that character is complex, but you know what? That character is like every high school dropout I ever met, or that character is complex, but that's exactly what my trans cousin is going through. I know what they're feeling. I want that. I don't want anyone to ever leave something I make feeling like I have no idea what just happened or how did that end. I want people to talk about it and feel something deeply, but I don't want people to that deep feeling to be deep confusion.
So you think when you work with your students, do you impose a little less ambiguity on their work?
Yes, I subbed for an instructor about 2 years ago, and it happened to be the day that these students were showing their work, short films. And I really am a fair teacher, but I like a good critique. Because I was critiqued in film school and grad school, and I learned from it. I have a thick skin, though. I know not everybody does. But I told the students, I have guidelines for critiquing. And one of them is, do not take this personally. It has nothing to do with you. I'm trying to help you get better. And this class is trying to help you get better. So the student showed his work and I critiqued it, honestly. And the biggest issue was what happened. It was completely ambiguous. So a semester later, I recognize this kid in my class, and I'm looking at him thinking, I know him. How do I know him? So after the class ended, I said, hey, were you in that lady's class that I subbed last semester? He's like, yeah, you ripped my movie to shreds. He's like, and I was kind of like, God, she's kind of mean. But then after class, and this is true, I went to him in the hall and I told him, you should take my advanced editing class. You are really skilled. You just need some guidance. He was really technically skilled. He needed lessons in storytelling. And so he's like, I really respected that you said that to me and I want to learn from you. And he ended up being an incredible student. He was very receptive to criticism and not criticism, but critique and instruction. And he learned a lot. But he would argue with me till this day that it was okay what he did because that ambiguity was okay. And I tried to explain to him, but it wasn't because your audience, I'm telling you as your audience member, I didn't get it. And I always tell my students, look, if there's 10 people in this class and I'm telling you, I don't understand it, that's 10% of your audience that doesn't get it. And I guarantee you there's usually 2 other people in the class that don't get it either, that don't want to say it. So it's probably 30% of your audience. And that's an issue. I think that's a problem. So yeah, I am very strict about that because at the end of the day, I don't want my students feeling like they can't do whatever they want creatively. They can't. But I want them to remember, just be prepared that 30% of your audience may not like this because you're confusing them, because you're not giving them enough.
And that young boy grew up to be Christopher Nolan, and he made Memento as a big F you, Kristen.
No, I love Memento as a vision artist. I love it.
I was going to say that, I mean, that's part of like the learning process too, right? Like if you want to be open to produce something like that and be like, I want this to be completely ambiguous. This is my goal. This is my, and I feel like I've achieved it, to then be open to you as the professor or teacher to be like, well, no, this is why it doesn't work. And this is why you have to play more to a 30% failure rate to your audience. As long as they're open to that and be like, okay, I can see this point and let me, work on that. Mm-hmm. I think that's great because I think that's the point of when you're in school is to try out those things. Be like, I'm going to make something completely ambiguous that makes no sense, but isn't this cool? And then you'd be like, okay, well, you've done that. Now let's get some structure and some story. And just to backtrack quickly, the point I was going to make when you're talking about Blue Valentine is I go back to my journalism roots and like, what's the most important piece to this story here? And it sounds like the most important piece was what happened to them in that interim. And you don't get that. And so that's a problem if you're like, be like, well, no, let the audience just fill that in with their own experiences. Okay. I'm like, well, all right. Well, that's an option. But like that to me sounded like the most important thing about that story was like, well, how did they get here? And to have that just completely omitted, I completely get why you found that to be a problem.
Another movie that Michelle Williams was in Brokeback Mountain, where I don't think you ever really find out what happened to Gyllenhaal's character.
There's ambiguity about that. There's a question because we know that he died on this. It sounds like when Anne Hathaway's character tells Ennis, I believe his name is, what happened.
And she's on the phone, right? Yep.
And it sounds like he got hit. He got into an accident on the side of the road, but when they flashed to it, it looks like he may have been hit in the face with a tire iron. And so it makes you wonder, did somebody do that because he was gay? Was he bashed? Mm-hmm. Did she have him killed? She was very angry. So there's ambiguity. He's dead, but there is ambiguity of how that happened. But that kind of ambiguity doesn't bother me because that's interesting. Like, oh, that's maybe he got bashed. Maybe she had him hit, but we know he's dead. He's not like, I don't know where he's at. Maybe if I was left wondering, is he out in the mountain looking for Ennis? That would kill me. I know he's not there. So the story kills you in a different way. You're heartbroken that he and Ennis couldn't be together. But I have the answer. He's not alive.
And maybe that's what the Ang Lee intention is, right? Is that it's not that he's dead, because that's something we all know. How that happened almost doesn't matter. What matters is that Ennis is now alone.
Yeah.
That's maybe the emotion. Again, going back to Pulp Fiction, like, oh, if we care about what's in the suitcase, it doesn't matter what's in the suitcase. Just follow these people along. Or even a movie that, Pete, you and I love is The Thing, where we don't get the clear ending with McCready and Childs. It's not about Carpenter giving it to you on a plate and saying, oh, look, here's a tentacle coming out of McCready's jacket, just so that we all know. It's like, nope, it's not about that. That's the point of the movie, is that we can't trust each other, or the line that I think McCready says when he's having the whiskey and he's like, we can't trust each other anymore, or like trust is eroding. It's like, that's the point. That's the point of the movie.
Yeah, and you don't get the cop out of like a stinger ending or something like that, where like, the film ends, you like, okay, here's the vision, but then like they feel the need to throw something else in at the end, either to be like, and here comes a sequel, or something that wrecks the whole point of like what you've experienced up to that point.
Los Angeles, 2019.
There was an escape from the off-world colonies. They slaughtered 20.
The assignment: track down 6 manufactured humans. He's the best man for the job, but he may die trying to prove it. Harrison Ford is the Blade Runner.
It's funny you mentioned sequel, because then I think about too, like Blade Runner and Deckard. But I remember like my mind being blown, because I was like, wait, is he a robot? And what's with the origami crane thing? And I don't fully get it. And it felt like with every version of the film, as I started to get into movies, the work print, Ridley Scott, a producer, somebody else being like, I am going to explain this to you, when I'm like, no. I'm good with this not being explained, because I get it, guys. Like, this was good. This was very interesting. I get the questions that you were trying to answer. As I've gotten older, I can appreciate it now more than I did certainly when I saw it. But then when you see the sequel and they're like, oh yeah, no, by the way, he's a replicant. And you're like, oh, okay, so there's one version of that film of the original. Then it's like, oh no, but there's like 6 versions. It's like, yeah, the sequel kind of makes it pretty obvious for us, guys. He's a replicant. We get it.
Yeah. And I think to Kristen's point, granted that's a film from 1982, but it was released in theaters because the producers got involved, and they're like, we need to have an unambiguous happy ending. And the film pretty much tanked at the box office. It has grown tremendously in stature, obviously, in the years since. And with all the other director's cut, producer's cut, all the other different versions of that film, which reintroduce more of that ambiguity and, really brings home the question, is Deckard a replicant? But again, to what you were talking about, Bernie, like that's besides the point. The point of the film is what makes us human, and what is being human, what is humanity. But audiences have, again, taken to that more ambiguous ending. Like those are the versions that they like, and those are the versions that they subscribe to, as opposed to the theatrical cut, which I think is pretty much discarded by almost everyone involved, including Ridley Scott at this point. So
the producers too, and how they brought in kind of like a half-hearted Harrison Ford. That's like, you will read this narration because we need to know what Deckard is thinking, and it'll make it feel noir. And I think you could probably put it under the guise of like, okay, cool, I get it. This is like Maltese Falcon or The Third Man. People are saying what they're thinking, and there's a lot of purple prose. But it's really the producers being like, people are confused, Ridley. So if you don't do it, then we'll get Harrison to come in on his day off and probably chain smoke and drink coffee all day while he's giving these half-hearted lines, because we need to make it clearer for people. Meanwhile, Pete, sounds like you and me were like, no, but this movie made me feel a certain way, it made me think a certain way. That's the magic. So I think that's what maybe the Ozone movies have done for you, Kristen, where, like, you're okay with the ambiguity because that's maybe their superpowers, that he was able to convey a well-told, intentional, clear story with some ambiguity sprinkles on top. And that's what you want to get served.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm using the word flourish. I don't know if that's the right description for it, but he's using it as a flourish at the end that gives you something extra to think or talk about, as opposed to it being the end of the film, where you're just kind of like, well, what just happened? Like, it's like, oh, that's interesting. Like you've got your completed story. And then there's that extra question that you can, noodle over or talk about amongst friends afterwards, if you'd like.
Are there any other movies, Kristen, beyond like the ones we've talked about, obviously the Ozone movies you mentioned, that either kind of exemplify that ambiguity to you? Maybe something that you could suggest to people that are like, okay, we get it, Bernie. We've seen Blade Runner, but like, this person actually knows what she's talking about. Like, can you throw out some stuff where people can add it to their queue and be like, hey, I have not heard of that. I want to watch that.
Well, I want to, Pete, you brought up The Lobster, and I feel bad you didn't get to like circle back to it, because I think that filmmaker.
Damn it, Pete, get your old podcast and talk about your lobster.
Having lobster for dinner.
Oh man, I'm allergic to shellfish.
I'm not. I would
movie,
not.
But are you allergic to Colin Farrell?
Not at all. Not at all. That's why you should see also the other movie that filmmaker did, Killing of Sacred Deer. It's phenomenal. Barry Keoghan's in it, and it's phenomenal. But that filmmaker, the end of The Lobster, I don't want to ruin things for people, but that ending is ambiguous. You don't know what exactly happens, and you also don't know. It's not that you don't know why. No, I'm gonna take this back. You don't know what happens, but you think you know what happens, and you know why it's going to happen.
If you fail to fall in love with someone during your stay here, you'll turn into an animal.
If you encounter any problems, you will be assigned children. That usually helps.
You're like a brother to me. Oh, you're my best friend in the whole world.
I don't think I'm your best friend in the whole world.
Have you thought of what animal you'd like to be if you end up alone?
Yes, a lobster.
A lobster is an excellent choice.
Simply put, it's a story about finding your mate, your soulmate, if you will, and you have to have something in common with that person in order to be matched with them. And he finds this person he thinks is his match. When they lose the thing they had in common, when they try to find something else, they can't find it, but they still want to be together. So he has to do something drastic to make him be like the woman. And you know he's going to do it. And I think, you think he's going to do it, but you know why he's going to do it because of the love he feels and the commitment and the partnership he wants with that person. So I would say watch The Lobster. I agree. It's an excellent movie. And then, I would say this movie is one of my favorite movies ever. And it's not that it's ambiguous necessarily, but the storytelling technique is a little interesting because it plays on the idea of which one is the actual story that's being told, which is, and I hope I don't get crucified for saying this filmmaker's name, but Woody Allen's Melinda and Melinda. It's a movie where there's a story being told, literally. It's a group of friends at a cafe talking about Melinda. And we kind of then go into the world of Melinda. So as the story is being told to this group of friends, sort of like the movie Forget Paris, where they're talking about this couple and you don't meet the couple till the end. But Melinda is different because you never meet Melinda. So you see Melinda. Melinda's played by Radha Mitchell in both stories. But in one story, you have characters around Melinda that include Johnny Lee Miller and Chloe Sevigny. Mm-hmm. And then the other side is Will Ferrell. Steve Carell's got a tiny role in it. And it's very different. Melinda's a very different person in both stories. So you're left at the end wondering, well, who is Melinda? Is she Melinda in this story or is she Melinda in that story? I know he's a divisive person. People are either going to want to see his films or not. I do try to separate the art from the artist. I mean, honestly, as odd as it sounds, Woody Allen, I can appreciate his movies. I think they're not great anymore, but his older stuff, it is a part of film history. I don't want to ignore it. And I do appreciate them for what they are. But that's a movie. And if you're not against watching his movies, I would say that's a good one to check out because of the way the story is told. He kind of does that, I think, in other movies too. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. Everyone Says I Love You kind of does that too, the musical he made.
I'll throw out real quick another film that I really enjoyed by the Coen brothers, A Serious Man, that has an ambiguous ending. But again, I think it's one of those that's palatable because, you know, what happens at the end, and we won't spoil anything, but you've got like your titular character has all these, you know, mishaps befall him. And just when it seems like he's getting his life back together, the ending kind of hits you with something, and it's like, is everything that he's been achieving about to just completely go up in smoke, or is there a happier ending there for him? And it's left very ambiguous, but I think again, it's in keeping with everything that the Coen brothers kind of have up until that point, where you're just kind of like, it's a bit of a gut punch, but you don't really know what happens. And so there's, you know, if you want to take the more positive outlook, you could be like, oh, maybe everything turns out okay. Possibly not. But I thought that was another example. Again, I think that one worked again for me because I was so invested in that story and the character, you know, very well acted. a lot of quirky side characters. And so I'm like, this is just very interesting storytelling. So I was on board. So when that happened at the end, and it's one of those quick endings, and you're just kind of like, oh shit, okay, well I guess that's that. And so I didn't feel cheated by something like that at the end.
I'm going to end with this, and I'm not going to give any story information because I think if you haven't seen it, you should see it. There was a movie that came out in 2010 called, I looked it up because I kept mixing up the name. It's called Last Night. She's an Iranian-American filmmaker. Her name is Masi Tajaddin, and it stars Keira Knightley, Sam Worthington, and Eva Mendes is in it. And it's a very simple story about a husband and wife, and they have an argument one night at a party, and it sort of sets both of them into thinking like, is there something better out there, or did I miss an opportunity? I'm not going to say anything, but the very end of that movie ends with Keira Knightley opens her mouth like she's going to say something, and then it cuts. And so you need to watch the movie to understand why that's important. And it's really good. It's really simple. It wasn't big. I don't think people would even know it by hearing me talk about it. But give it a shot. It's very it makes you think about things like, what would you do if you thought you could get away with it, like in a relationship? If you thought there was no risk of getting caught, what would you do?
As always, you've given us a bunch of films for us to kind of dive into. Cool. That's one of the beautiful things about having you on, and obviously with your passion talking about these things and your editing expertise. Like I still recall the time when we kind of went through like the shots from Silence of the Lambs, and and just thinking about film in a different way. I definitely lacking on my French cinema lately, so I know I have at least 3 to catch up on. I did because I was curious. Summer of '85, I had to watch the trailer, and on top of it, reminding me a little bit of Call Me by Your Name, just in the trailer.
Yes.
It featured The Cure's In Between Days, and then the soundtrack. So immediately I'm saying, well, I'm definitely going to have to watch this.
Yes, there is a very similar feel to this idea of the mid 80s European country town, young men, sexual exploration. There are similarities for sure. And I actually brought that filmmaker up in our text conversation today because European filmmakers, sometimes they hit it on the head when they do this. So yeah, check out Summer of '85. It's amazing. So is Swimming Pool. It's a little bit harder to find Swimming Pool. Young and Beautiful might be a little bit harder to find too, but they're worth it. They're really, really good.
That's the best thing about talking to you, Kristen. By the time we're done, I have to subscribe to 7 streaming services because I have to.
I work for all of them. I get a little bit of
Is there a French cinema streaming service that we don't know about? Like
WePix.
There we go. That's it right there.